Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my rest of season rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be introducing my top 36 running back and wide receiver rankings, along with my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings for the remainder of the season. Besides that, I'll also be including the rest of season strength of schedule for all four primary positions throughout different spectrums of time: weeks 11 through 17, the remainder of the season, and weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoffs, so that you know which players have the most advantageous matchups that could lead you to a 2023 fantasy football championship. In the last couple weeks, many of you guys have voiced your desire for a rest of seasons rankings video, so I wanted to go ahead and get this out to you guys prior to your upcoming trade deadlines, whether that's this upcoming weekend or a future date. Now, of course, if you're looking for a specific position, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you have yet to do so already, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship. And of course, besides presenting the rankings on screen, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours for the remainder of the season. These rankings are for each individual week. They're by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. All you got to do is go ahead, use code Andrew, and make that first-time deposit today, minimum of $10, and be eligible. Of course, your eligibility is determined by your current location based on the right side of the screen, so take advantage of the opportunity today. At the end of today's video, I'll go ahead and put together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy, because typically on Fridays, I go ahead and include a couple pick'em slips with the hidden gems, considering we don't have a hidden gems episode today, and we had a 4-0-1 record last week. I want to continue that momentum. So for those of you guys who want to take advantage of course, drafting via Underdog Fantasy responsibly, and of course, putting together a couple pick'em slips, you can go ahead and do so and take advantage of the new customer special for this upcoming Sunday, which is Russell Wilson 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much for all the support and using code Andrew. All right, so let's talk about my rest of season rankings from weeks 11 through 17. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 36 running backs ranked. Now, if I was to talk about all 100 plus players on today's episode, I would be here for multiple hours. I mean, when I talk about 36 players on a Tuesday, it typically takes 40 minutes. So you can imagine that I'm not going to be able to talk about all of these running backs. So if you want to, please go ahead and click the pause button. I just want to go ahead and give you context. This is for a half PPR scoring format. Also, keep in mind that rankings are always subject to change. There are going to be injuries like last night, Joe Burrow, Mark Andrews, unfortunately going down, that could end up shaking up these rankings. But as of this current moment in time, these are my rest of season rankings for a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league, for the remainder of the season. Now, when we talk about rest of season strength of schedule, I wanted to go ahead and talk about the spectrum of time, weeks 11 through 17. As you guys can see, the number one ranked team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, have the most advantageous schedule going forward. Now, this is overall determined by how defenses have played against opposing running backs from weeks 5 through 10. So when you go ahead and isolate that with the remaining schedule that is left, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Los Angeles Rams, Los Angeles Chargers, Philadelphia Eagles, New England Patriots, they have the most advantageous strength of schedule going forward. While on the other end of the spectrum, the Arizona Cardinals, the Detroit Lions, the Cleveland Browns, New York Jets, Baltimore Ravens, they have the toughest strength of schedule going forward. But in order to give you a little bit more context, the number of like 14.3 that sits next to the Pittsburgh Steelers, that's the average amount of fantasy points that the defenses that they're going to face for the remainder of the season allow to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated, that being rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. So the difference between the Pittsburgh Steelers and Arizona Cardinals isn't a huge difference. So you could still get great performances out of James Conner, the running back to the Detroit Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs, and David Montgomery for the remainder of the season without really having to worry, even though the strength of schedule is difficult. But I just wanted to go ahead and present this. Now, when we talk about weeks 11 through 14, for those of you who are still trying to make the fantasy football playoffs and trying to put yourself in the best position to do so, because perhaps over the course of the season you've dealt with a lot of injuries or unlucky situations, if in fact you're still trying to make the playoffs, this would be the most advantageous players to have on roster for the remainder of the season, weeks 11 through 14. You might want to also avoid players that have upcoming buys between now and then to go ahead and ensure that you have victories within the next couple weeks to make your playoffs. Now, speaking of the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, we have the following. The Philadelphia Eagles have the most advantageous strength of schedule, followed by the Houston Texans, Pittsburgh Steelers, Los Angeles Chargers. Again, a lot of the same teams that I mentioned before, but one that's jumped to the top of this conversation, DeAndre Swift, through weeks 15 through 17 very easily can be capturing many of us fantasy football championships, and perhaps is a player that we should be going ahead and trading for in the next coming days. Outside of that, let's go ahead and transition to the wide receiver conversation. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, in a half PPR scoring format, these are my top 36 wide receivers for the remainder of the season. When I was finalizing these overall rankings, I was thinking to myself, well, okay, Jamar Chase without Joe Burrow, that makes a huge impact, obviously, but I still think that he could still be relevant for fantasy football purposes. If a guy like Garrett Wilson can still be a top 24 wide receiver without Aaron Rodgers, which of course Aaron Rodgers could end up returning and elevating the overall value of Garrett Wilson. Time will tell on that, but the current ranking of Garrett Wilson just assumes that he'll have, Zach Wilson with him for the remainder of the season. But if in fact we can get Garrett Wilson to be just as fantasy relevant with Zach Wilson, I'm sure that Browning can elevate Jamar Chase considering how elite of a wide receiver he is in that overall conversation. Nonetheless, if you want to go ahead and look at these rankings, you can pause the screen. Let's go ahead and transition to rest of season strength of schedule. As you guys can see, from weeks 11 through 17, the New Orleans Saints at the top of this conversation, the teams that they're going to be facing are allowing 30.24 fantasy points per game on average in terms of wide receiving statistics isolated in a half PPR. That's receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Of course, Chris Olave is in a fantastic position. The next team in this conversation, Marquise Hollywood Brown, could have himself a great rest of season, and so should all of the wide receivers of the Seattle Seahawks. DK Metcalf, who I've talked about in weeks past, of someone that you want to be trading for. Tyler Lockett, hopefully he'll be healthy for the upcoming weeks. I know he didn't practice earlier today. We'll have to wait and see what happens in week 11. Jackson Smith and Jigba, another one of these great receiving options. Nonetheless, these are the most advantageous and most disadvantageous matchups going forward for the remainder of the fantasy football season. Now, when we go ahead and just talk about teams that are still trying to make the fantasy football playoffs, of course, we have weeks 11 through 14. You can see the Indianapolis Colts, Michael Pittman Jr., Josh Downs should have themselves a pretty good strength of schedule here with Gardner Minshew at quarterback. The San Francisco 49ers should continue to buzzsaw teams on a weekly basis. Chicago Bears, of course, DJ Moore with Justin Fields returning. In 3 of the last 4 games that DJ Moore has played with Justin Fields, he's at 100 or more receiving yards. So the expectation is some good overall performances going forward. Now, when we go ahead and talk about the final spectrum of time for the wide receiver position, we have weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoffs, of course, still at the top of this conversation. We have teams and players like Chris Olave, Marquise Hollywood Brown, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp with the Los Angeles Rams, Baltimore Ravens wide receiver options, of course, are going to get a boost because of the absence of Mark Andrews. Now, speaking of Mark Andrews, now that I've gone ahead and covered this, you can pause, but let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about my top 16 tight end rankings, but I also wanted to go ahead and include a couple other tight ends at the bottom of the screen. Of course, with Mark Andrews out, there's no other players that I truly do believe deserve a spot in the A tier alongside of TJ Hawkinson. He truly is performing on a weekly basis and earning the potential to be in that top tier conversation, but that is the Kelsey tier typically, right? That S tier is always at the top, and that typically is only Kelsey. But nonetheless, I wanted to also include Dallas Goedert and Darren Waller at the very bottom of the screen because both those guys are dealing with injuries. If I'm not mistaken, Darren Waller won't be back due to the injured reserve stint that he has until week 14. And Dallas Goedert, that is a to-be-determined situation. They did not send him to the injured reserve, but the expectation is that he's going to miss the next couple weeks at a base minimum. I don't know when they return, so I just wanted to go ahead and throw them out as a caveat. Keep them in your injured reserve spots for the future, but the rest of these guys are the options in terms of my 1 through 16, but I threw Pat Freiermuth in there as the kind of honorable mention number 17. Okay, let's talk about the strength of schedule at the tight end position. As you guys can see, the Detroit Lions have the easiest strength of schedule. That's fantastic for Sam Laporta. The Baltimore Ravens at the top of this conversation as well. Unfortunately, no Mark Andrews. Very unfortunate. I don't think that Isaiah Likely will be able to pick up where he left off. We've seen on multiple occasions over the course of Isaiah Likely's young career already, in the absence of Mark Andrews, we don't see much production out of Isaiah Likely within this offense, which is unfortunate, but it is the reality of the situation. But in terms of the Detroit Lions, they're going up against teams that are allowing 11.44 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends from weeks 5 through 10. Therefore, we find the following number for the remainder of the season, and we continue on. When we talk about weeks 11 through 14, teams that are still trying to make the fantasy football playoffs, for those of you who are looking for a tight end that could help you get there, Arizona tight end Trey McBride could end up leading you into that overall conversation, but understand there are still many teams that are, have upcoming bye weeks, and that could end up being a pain if in fact you have Trey McBride on your team, you need him for an upcoming week, he misses due to the bye week, that could end up hurting you, so just keep that in mind. But Trey McBride for the remainder of, of course, this regular fantasy football season should be a fantastic option. Let's close it out with the rest of season strength of schedule in terms of fantasy football playoffs at the tight end position. The Tennessee Titans at the top of this conversation. Of course, Chigoziem Okonkwo hasn't played up to his overall, standard that he showed last season. Of course, the Giants tight end, if in fact Darren Waller returns and he is healthy, could end up putting together some, great performances from weeks 15 through 17. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present this. When you go ahead and see teams at the bottom of this conversation, though, Houston Texans, Chicago Bears, Philadelphia Eagles, again, the tight ends that are associated with those teams, Dallas Goedert, Cole Kmet, and Dalton Schultz, have all played well. The tight end position is so thin that we cannot really worry about those overall matchups making an impact. Sure, you can go ahead and try to trade for another tight end at this current moment in time, but I do trust that those guys will be able to get the job done regardless, because what they get is opportunity. And getting opportunity at the tight end position in terms of targets is very seldom. That's why we don't have much depth at the position. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and transition to the final position I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about some quarterbacks. As you guys can see, the top of this conversation has changed in terms of the last time I had a rest of season rankings video. I continued to have Josh Allen at the top of that conversation. We have now transitioned to Jalen Hurts, who has been far more consistent this season. And going forward, I expect to have, a lot of shootout matchups, especially this upcoming week as they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Nonetheless, in the A tier, we have guys like Dak Prescott. Of course, Lamar Jackson typically is my number 4 for the entirety of the season. Unfortunately, the injury last night to Mark Andrews is certainly going to have to move him down a little bit in my mind in comparison to some of these other quarterback options. Of course, he's still going to have the rushing potential, but considering Gus Edwards is, cleaning up on the ground, Lamar Jackson takes a little bit of a dive there in terms of his overall ranking. But again, a lot of these players, guys that you already have on roster, that you can trust, and going forward should be fantastic options for fantasy purposes. Let's go ahead and let's talk about the strength of schedule here. Quarterbacks from weeks 11 through 17. The Dallas Cowboys at the top of this conversation. There's not really much of a surprise as to why I have Dak so high in my overall rest of season rankings, on top of the fact that he's playing just as good as any other quarterback right now in the National Football League in terms of fantasy football, potential upside, statistics, all that kind of jazz. The New Orleans Saints at the top of this conversation as well. I don't have Derek Carr there, primarily because there's always a potential of Taysom Hill stealing touchdowns, which could end up hurting his fantasy value. There's other teams here like the San Francisco 49ers. I trust in Brock Purdy, but the Jets, the Giants, the Green Bay Packers, again, these are teams that are definitely not ones that we want to go looking for quarterbacks at this current moment in time, unless Aaron Rodgers is on the return. And of course, the Jets are still in the playoff hunt. Now, when we talk about weeks 11 through 14, for those of you who are still trying to make the fantasy football playoffs and trying to clinch a position, you probably want to avoid players that have upcoming bye weeks. But outside of that, the Dallas Cowboys still at the top of this conversation, along with the San Francisco 49ers. On the other end of the spectrum, the Chargers, the Minnesota Vikings, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Los Angeles Rams. I trust in, guys like Justin Herbert. With Justin Jefferson eventually coming back, Joshua Dobbs is still going to be a solid option, especially when we consider his overall rushing upside and how many fantasy points he's able to accrue just off of that alone. Outside of that, the final overall strength of schedule at the quarterback position, we have weeks 15 through 17. As you guys can see, the New Orleans Saints, Broncos, Titans, Rams, Bills at the top of this conversation. Again, outside of Josh Allen, I guess Russell Wilson if we get into that conversation, but you'd have to be dealing with a lot of quarterback injuries. Maybe just lost Joe Burrow and you're going to roster, a guy like Russell Wilson for the remainder of the season. But outside of Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Brock Purdy, at the very top of this conversation, everybody else is kind of in the middle of the pack. Everybody else can be a solid quarterback option for the fantasy football playoffs. But of course, you want to continue to play your studs for the remainder of the season. With all of this information covered, that is going to conclude my rest of season rankings, strength of schedule video for today's episode. Thank you everybody for watching. If you appreciate all the content that I went ahead and cooked up for today, be sure to click the like button down below, subscribe if you have not yet already. I'm going to close out today's video by putting together a couple pick'em slips. Like I mentioned last Friday, throughout my hidden gems video, I suggested 5 plays. I went 4-0-1. The one overall play was 6.0 targets from Dalton Kincaid. He got 6 targets. So if you put all 5 of those legs within a play, you still got 10x your overall play, $10 to 100. It was a great overall week nonetheless. Let's go ahead and let's talk about a couple plays that I like for this upcoming weekend. So first and foremost, I want to begin by talking about Austin Eckler. Anytime Austin Eckler, Christian McCaffrey, these kind of elite running backs have the potential of having rushing or receiving yards in their potential play, we'll take that, especially going up against the Green Bay Packers that just gave up 3 rushing touchdowns and a huge load of yards to David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, whether it was on the ground or through the air. My expectation this week for Austin Eckler is, of course, he's going to continue his streak of scoring a touchdown. He has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. He has scored 43 touchdowns in the last 39 regular season games that he has played. My expectation this week is a touchdown for Austin Eckler going up against the Green Bay Packers defense. The next player that I really like going into this week is Trey McBride taking on the Houston Texans and being able to surpass his number of 53.5 receiving yards. Again, like I mentioned earlier this week in my tight end and quarterback rankings video, the Houston Texans are at the very top in terms of the most advantageous matchups at the tight end position. Trey McBride is coming off of a week in which he had, 9 targets, 8 receptions, over 100 receiving yards with Kyler Murray. This offense continues to utilize the tight end position at a high capacity, and they'll continue to look in his direction for a lot of potential upside as a security blanket for Kyler Murray in the absence of Zach Ertz. My expectation in a matchup in which they should keep competing back and forth with the Houston Texans. If not, the Houston Texans could make this a shootout if they go ahead and start off hot early. This should be an exciting game. And of course, Trey McBride should be able to surpass 53.5 receiving yards. Now, while on the topic of this game potentially being a shootout, I want to talk about Tank Dell. His current number is at 7.5 targets. Last week, I made a lot of money off of targets alone, whether it was Garrett Wilson, whether it was TJ Hawkinson and or Dalton Kincaid. Going into this week, a week in which we're coming off of a performance where Tank Dell had 14 total targets, only 6 receptions, but the opportunity was significantly there. If this is going to be another matchup in which, of course, they're airing it out in the absence of Noah Brown this week, it's going to be Nico Collins and Tank Dell as the number 1 and 2. Tank Dell is going to continue to see himself a lead opportunity within this offense. I'm expecting him to surpass 7.5 targets. That should be a very easy number for him to surpass, considering he's done it in each of the last 2 games. Now, moving on from Tank Dell, who has played extremely well as of late, let's talk about a wide receiver who's literally been the number 1 in the last 3 weeks. A guy that's literally averaging 15 targets per game, or nearly 15 targets per game in the last 3 performances. I think 8.5 targets is just criminally low. It truly is. I think 83.5 receiving yards is criminally low. He's been able to get himself 11 plus receptions in each of the last 3 games minimum. All of these numbers in my mind are just low. When you take on the Carolina Panthers, the way that the Dallas Cowboys have been functioning as an offense, continuing to get CeeDee Lamb a high volume of utilization, my expectation for this upcoming weekend's game is that CeeDee Lamb should be able to accomplish this. I'll take this target number of him surpassing 8.5 targets this week and getting himself, of course, a huge workload of opportunity. To close out the 5 overall plays, we have Terry McLaurin, and I'm suggesting that you take him going higher than 60.5 receiving yards. Here is the logic. Terry McLaurin in his entire career has never had a bad performance against the New York Giants. In a half PPR scoring format, going back to his rookie season, he has never had less than 10 fantasy points in a game against that defense. My expectation is that Terry McLaurin has himself another big performance over the course of his entire career against the New York Giants. These are his receiving yard totals: 86, 74, 115, 107, 93, 105, 70, and 90. 90 was earlier this season in a game in which he had 9 targets, 6 catches, 90 receiving yards in a 7-14 loss to the New York Giants. I'm expecting Sam Howell, Terry McLaurin to both succeed, but of course, Terry McLaurin to have himself an incredible performance this week as the final leg of this 5-play pick'em slip. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tomorrow, I'll be live at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Sunday morning, 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Can't wait to see you guys there. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.